For over 3 years, Japan has watched as Russian President Vladimir Putin has tried to exert his expansionist will on Ukraine. Now, it's had enough, and Japan is joining the fight by cementing itself as a new NATO ally to support Ukraine. While Japan creating deeper ties with NATO will only mean good things for Ukraine's fight against Russia, it has even deeper ramifications on a global scale. With this one move, Japan may be setting itself up as a major power player against 3 of the world's most dangerous threats: Russia, China, and North Korea. On April 8th, Japanese Defense Minister Gen Nakatani held talks with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte in Tokyo. There, the two discussed several issues, including Japan's current involvement in the Ukraine war and the rising threat of China in the Indo-Pacific region. However, the headline talking point was one raised by Nakatani. Japan wants to join the NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine, or NSATU, program. There aren't many more details than that. Beyond expressing a desire to join NSATU, Nakatani didn't specify what role he intends for Japan's self-defense force members to take in the program. He also didn't say how many soldiers Japan would be sending, assuming it sends any at all. The one thing known for sure is that Japanese cooperation won't involve any element of combat. That suggests that Nakatani intends to use Japan's military to help Ukraine get better at defending itself without getting drawn into the fight itself. In the wake of his discussions with Rutte, Nakatani explained Japan's decision. Both Japan and NATO face many challenges, and our security environment has become increasingly severe, he told assembled press members April 8th. He also underscored the risk that Russia poses both to Europe and Asia, while explaining that Japan's NSATU involvement would offer learning opportunities for his own country as well as Ukraine. What is the NSATU program exactly? Created by NATO in the wake of Putin's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, NSATU is a special NATO command that exists to coordinate training and the provision of military equipment for Ukraine. Think of it as an intermediary program that makes it easier for Ukraine to access the extensive aid being provided to it by its Western partners. NATO explains that the program involves several components, chief among them being the coordination of training held at NATO-aligned facilities in countries outside Ukraine. Examples of that sort of training might be the sessions Ukraine's pilots underwent when learning how to use the F-16s that its Western allies are providing to it. Beyond that training, NSATU manages the billions of dollars of military aid sent to Ukraine since February 2022. Right now, that figure stands at a little under $280 billion committed to Ukraine by the US and Europe. Another $130.7 billion is waiting in the wings, having already been committed by Ukraine's European partners but not yet distributed. NSATU ensures all of that money and the equipment it buys gets to where it needs to go. Beyond these two major goals, NSATU also supports Ukraine in the repair, maintenance, and ongoing management of much of the equipment it's received from the West. That's an important factor in Ukraine's defense. Before Putin invaded, its military equipment was mostly Soviet-era relics that were even older than the weapons Russia brought to the table. Again, fighter jets are a perfect example. Before the arrival of F-16s, Ukraine could only field older Russian jets such as the MiG-29 and Su-25. Ukraine had about 105 of these jets at the start of the war and still has about the same amount now. That suggests that Ukraine has barely used these jets because it knows they can be taken down by Russia's aerial defenses. The arrival of F-16s was a boon, but it could have also left Ukraine with a maintenance burden it wouldn't have been able to overcome without NSATU. Finally, NSATU has the long-term goal of ensuring the continued development of Ukraine's armed forces. NATO isn't clear about what this specifically means. NSATU may be helping Ukraine with its ongoing efforts to build more weapons on its own territory, for instance. What can be said for sure, though, is that NSATU is helping Ukraine to develop a more westernized armed forces that feature technologies that integrate and are interoperable with those used by NATO. NSATU isn't a small project. It has a base in Wiesbaden, Germany, along with a trio of logistical hubs based in the eastern territory of the NATO alliance. The project is also led by German Army Major General Hartmut Renck, who's a 3-star general who reports directly to NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe. NATO has committed 700 personnel from NATO allies and Ukraine itself to the program, which has been running since December 2024. That explanation perhaps makes Japan's intended role in Ukraine's fight against Russia clearer. If Japan is a member of NSATU, the door is open for a country to provide training in its more advanced weapons to Ukraine. That training could lead to Japan facilitating future military aid to Ukraine via the group, rather than trying to arrange it all on its own. So Nakatani's comments can be boiled down to a simple concept: help Japan to streamline how it provides aid to Ukraine, and more of that aid will be incoming. To date, Japan has played only a limited role in supporting Ukraine's forces. Though it won't commit any of its soldiers to Ukraine, which is in line with most of Ukraine's NATO allies, Japan has been pushed into reconsidering its stance on war due to Putin's invasion. Ever since the end of World War II, the country has taken a pacifist stance. This stance is enshrined in Article 9 of Japan's constitution, which states, "Aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes." The article goes on to claim that Japan will never maintain its land, sea or air forces, which we already know it's doing. However, it's the part about using force to settle international disputes that's the most interesting from the Ukraine war perspective. Japan's perception of its own pacifist clause was already starting to shift due to the actions of China in the Indo-Pacific. When Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, opinions about the article shifted further. A poll conducted that same year found that 33% of Japanese people were in favor of amending Article 9, with only 20% being against it. The other 43% claimed to have no opinion. As the years have progressed, similar surveys have been conducted that show a deeper shift toward the abandonment of pacifism. An NHK poll says that 35% are in favor of an amendment versus 17% against. Yomiuri, which is a conservative Japanese newspaper, found that 60% want to amend the article. Even one of Japan's more liberal newspapers, Asahi, says that 51% of people want to see a change. What's emerging in Japan when it comes to Ukraine and NATO may be a manifestation of the beginning of an entire cultural shift in the country. That shift is demonstrated by the sheer amount of aid Japan has already provided to Ukraine. Even before the NSATU proposal, Japan has pledged more than $6 billion to Ukraine. Bear in mind that Japan is in Asia. There are literally thousands of miles separating it and Ukraine, with Russia's invasion not posing a direct threat to Japan as it does to many of the European countries supporting Ukraine. Japan's donations have included about $1 billion in grants, plenty of humanitarian assistance, and defensive or non-lethal military equipment such as body armor. Now that Japan wants to join NSATU, it may not be long before we see the country provide actual weapons to help Ukraine fight against Putin. If that happens, the cultural shift away from pacifism in Japan will be complete, which leads to another question. Why is Japan proposing NSATU involvement now? Part of that answer involves Japan's desire to strengthen its already deepening ties to NATO. Japan isn't a member of the alliance, with the very name of the group explaining why, as NATO is a cooperative effort between nations in North America and Europe. However, Mark Rutte explained that his meeting with Nakatani involved him explaining how a combination of Russia, China and North Korea are undermining global security, and that means what happens in Euro-Atlantic matters in the Indo-Pacific, and vice versa. Nakatani, along with the rest of Japan, is already well aware of this fact. That's why we've seen plenty of evidence of deepening Japan-NATO ties, both before and after Nakatani's NSATU announcement. For instance, November 2023 saw former NATO Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, David Van Veel, visit Japan to discuss issues related to cyber defense and the hybrid threats countries like Russia pose. In October 2024, Japan and South Korea, along with New Zealand and Australia, joined a NATO Defense Ministerial meeting for the first time in their history. That event marked a notable evolution in NATO's engagement strategy, according to Intelli News. All four nations had participated in meetings of NATO leaders before. Being invited at the ministerial level essentially meant that all four were almost being treated as de facto NATO members. The period after Rutte visited with Nakatani also revealed just how much deeper Japan's ties to NATO were becoming. Japan's Prime Minister, Shigeru Ishiba, met with Rutte after Nakatani. Ishiba kept his comment simple. "A stronger NATO will benefit Japan greatly," he said in a joint statement with Rutte. The pair also strongly condemned the growing relationship between Russia and North Korea, while calling on Putin to agree to a ceasefire. So, Japan's desire to join NSATU can be seen as part of its ongoing efforts to get closer to NATO. It may never become a member unless the organization changes its rules and starts allowing in nations from other continents. However, Japan can essentially act like a member because supporting Ukraine via NSATU ultimately feeds into Japan's other major goal, countering the joint threat that Russia, China, and North Korea present to the country. Rutte made the links between China and North Korea clear while speaking in Japan.
China is supporting the Russian war effort. China is building up its armed forces, including its navy, at a rapid pace. So we cannot be naive, and we really have to work together, assess what is happening.
The message was clear. Japan's cooperation with NATO tackles both the Chinese and Russian problems, or that should be the joint problem of China and Russia. As the National Bureau of Asian Research, or NBR, highlights, the last decade has seen cooperative military exercises between the US and nations in the Indo-Pacific focus on the threats of military action by either China or North Korea. That made sense. Before Putin invaded Ukraine, China and Russia worked alongside the international community to impose sanctions on North Korea. Now, the situation has changed drastically. Russia is allied with North Korea to the point where the two nations have a cooperative defense pact. That brings Russia into the Indo-Pacific game. Military preparedness should expand from their focus on North Korean nuclear, missile, and conventional threats to cover the possibility of a Russian military intervention in a crisis on the Korean peninsula, claims the NBR. That crisis could see Russia support North Korea with troops, equipment, cyber, and even nuclear options, all of which have a potentially massive impact on Japan. And there's already some precedent. North Korea has supplied Russia with over 10,000 soldiers since the two signed their cooperative defense pact. It's also delivering around 3 million artillery shells to Putin's forces per year. Japan can't ignore the possibility, perhaps even the likelihood, that North Korea is doing this because it believes it'll receive the same level of support from Russia if it ensures the Ukraine war plays out in Putin's favor. China, on the other hand, has a far longer strategic partnership with Russia. It also has a longer history of making threats toward Japan. On the Russia front, China has joined Putin in withdrawing from any efforts to place sanctions on North Korea, suggesting the three nations are far more open to working together than they've been in the past. China is also largely responsible for propping up Putin's Ukraine war effort, both monetarily and in terms of ensuring Russia's leader can build the equipment his soldiers need. On the financial side, China has been one of the top buyers of Russian oil ever since Western nations combined to both place a price cap on that oil and pull away from buying it. For instance, China bought 47% of all Russia's crude oil exports between December 2022 and January 2025. It also purchased 45% of the coal Russia produced, 11% of its refined oil products, 22% of Russia's liquid natural gas, and 27% of its pipeline gas. All of those purchases add up to billions of dollars being poured into Putin's coffers, which he's been using to fund his Ukraine invasion. China's involvement in the militaristic aspects of the Ukraine conflict has been more indirect, similar to Japan's. Where Japan provides non-lethal aid, China sells dual-use products such as microelectronics to Russia. Those products have legitimate commercial and consumer purposes, allowing China to plausibly deny that it's supporting Putin in his war efforts. However, the term dual-use means they can also be used to help Russia build weapons. Think of semiconductors for missiles and drones. It all adds up to increased cooperation between Russia, China, and North Korea. And there's more. For instance, North Korea joined Russian military drills as an observer for the first time in December 2024. In March 2025, Russia and China joined Iran to conduct military drills in the Gulf of Oman, the fifth consecutive year those drills have taken place. Japan is watching all of this and seeing an axis forming. It no longer has to worry about China or North Korea as individual entities anymore. It also has to worry about Russia supporting and working alongside both. It has to consider the possibility that Putin will send troops and equipment to North Korea if that country ever starts trouble. It also has to think about what the many threats China has made against Japan in recent years means in the context of deep support from Russia. Beijing isn't shy about letting Japan know about its aspirations for Indo-Pacific dominance. Japan is seeing its security environment in the Indo-Pacific rapidly deteriorate before its eyes, with China posing the greatest threat. A China that's backed by Russia would be too much for Japan to deal with, hence its desire to deepen its ties with NATO. And those deepening NATO ties are manifesting right now both in Japan's support of Ukraine and the boosting of its own military. Focus on the latter point for a moment, because it shows just how serious Japan is about becoming a key contributor to NSATU. In December 2024, the Royal United Services Institute noted that Japan has committed to increasing its defense budget so that it reaches 2% of the country's gross domestic product, or GDP, by 2027. If that number sounds familiar, it's because NATO recommends that its members spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Japan may be actively trying to show NATO that it not only supports the group, and Ukraine by extension, but that support runs deep enough for it to follow NATO guidelines. In 2025, this rising military spending will reach $55.1 billion. That's 9.4% more than Japan spent on its military in 2024, and the increase marks the 13th year in a row that Japan has increased its defense budget. Japan's priorities with this money remain at home. It's allocating cash to the purchases of new Type 12 sea-launched anti-ship missiles, the development of new submarine-launched missiles, and gliding projectiles that are ideal for island defense. Still, it's hard to ignore what this increase, and those to come, mean for Japan as a military player. Japan's not happy to sit on the sidelines anymore, and frankly, it's no longer an option. China is too big of a threat, and Putin is attempting to expand the Russian Empire in Europe. Japan has realized that it needs to step up individually and figure out how to cooperate more deeply with its partners, because it realizes that Rutte was right. The threat that Putin poses in Ukraine today could evolve into a threat that Russia, China, North Korea and their partners bring to Japan's shores tomorrow. So, what do all of Japan's recent moves really mean? The answer is simple. Japan is ready to step into NATO in whatever way it can to provide support to Ukraine. That support, at least in the most immediate sense, will come through its desire to participate in NSATU. NATO and Ukraine will welcome that participation. There's a lot of value Japan can deliver to the program, especially on the technological front, that could benefit Ukraine in the future. However, it's not too naive to believe that Japan is acting solely out of a desire to keep Ukraine safe. It's doing all of this with its own interest in mind too. By strengthening Ukraine through its NATO cooperation, Japan weakens Russia's attempts to occupy Ukraine. That's important, given that a weakened Russia can't feed into the threats that China and North Korea are attempting to pose to the Indo-Pacific. It's all interlinked. Japan's enemies become weaker when Ukraine's enemies lose strength. And who knows, Japan could ultimately paving the way toward the formation of a new NATO-like alliance in Asia. Prime Minister Ishiba has already advocated for such a group to be formed, and if it is, Japan would likely be near the top, along with many other Asian countries that are concerned about China, Russia, and their allies. An Asian NATO would surely work alongside the existing NATO, strengthening global resistance against leaders like Putin, all of which feeds back into helping Ukraine overcome the threat it faces now. With its NSATU announcement, Japan may have taken its first step toward becoming a vital global military player. Only time will tell just how much of a positive impact those moves will have on Ukraine in its fight against Putin's Russia. But what do you think about Japan's NSATU announcement? How do you think Japan will participate in the program when its proposal to join is accepted? Are we seeing the early seeds being planted for an Asian NATO to come to life? And if we are, what will that group mean for the future of the Ukraine war? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more commentary on the latest global geopolitical developments. We're an independent source of news and information for military conflicts around the world, and very much appreciate your support.